In a world where one wrong move meant global extinction, the superpowers played a high-stakes game of tactical chicken. This was a war fought not with armies, but with anxiety, a tactical dance on the razor's edge of global annihilation. The ultimate strategy wasn't to win the war, but to convince your enemy that you were crazy enough to start it. The superpowers engaged in a high-stakes game of tactical chicken, where the loser meant planetary ruin. The foundation of this terror was the concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The MAD doctrine defined the geopolitical standoff as a guaranteed bilateral destruction upon a full-scale nuclear attack. This theoretical parity was achieved once both the USA and the USSR developed sufficient arsenals, primarily ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and SLBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, to absorb a first strike and still retain the capacity to deliver a devastating retaliatory strike. The logic was cold. Since no nation could survive, no nation would initiate. Key figures like Robert McNamara formalized this concept, transforming nuclear arsenals from weapons of war into tools of deterrence. The technical requirement for MAD was that weapons needed to be hardened in silos or made mobile via submarines, guaranteeing survivability. MAD transformed conflict. Victory was impossible. Only deterrence mattered in this nuclear standoff. Central to MAD was the concept of second strike capability, the bedrock of deterrence. This technical ability ensured that a nation could withstand a massive surprise nuclear attack, the first strike, and still retaliate effectively. This required extreme hardening of infrastructure, such as reinforced underground ICBM silos, and continuous patrol by nuclear submarines, boomers, which were virtually undetectable. A successful second strike had to be guaranteed, making any initial attack suicidal for the aggressor. The development of Minuteman missiles in hardened silos by the US and their Soviet R-16 counterparts solidified this existential balance, ensuring that the decision to launch was synonymous with national suicide. The guarantee of a devastating second strike was the only thing that prevented the first strike from ever happening. To understand brinkmanship, we must first analyze the math behind the madness, game theory. Game theory, pioneered by John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern, was officially adopted by military strategists to model conflict and predict enemy response. The central concept applied to the Cold War was the minimax theorem, seeking the strategy that minimized the maximum possible loss. Von Neumann's work shifted the focus from military might to psychological modeling, treating the superpower conflict as a zero-sum game where one side's gain was the other's loss. This framework led to the understanding that even mutual non-cooperation, not launching nukes, was the only rational choice, illustrating the grim logic of MAD. The modeling influenced everything from targeting protocols to troop deployment strategies. John von Neumann turned global war into a mathematical equation, proving that mutual restraint was the only rational outcome. Brinkmanship was the art of controlled escalation, pushing the opponent to the edge without falling over. The defining moment of brinkmanship arrived in October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The crisis was triggered by the discovery of Soviet medium and intermediate-range ballistic missiles, MRBMs and IRBMs, being installed in Cuba. US U-2 spy planes provided undeniable photographic evidence on October 14, 1962, proving Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's aggressive military positioning. These missiles, particularly the R-12, SS-4, and R-14, SS-5, had the range to strike nearly all major U.S. cities within minutes, drastically reducing the early warning time from 15 minutes, ICBM, to less than 5. President John F. Kennedy immediately convened the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM, to manage this unparalleled threat to U.S. security. Soviet Premier Khrushchev placed missiles in Cuba, reducing U.S. warning time from minutes to mere seconds. The world held its breath. President Kennedy responded on October 22 not with a direct military attack, a strike, but with a strategic quarantine or naval blockade around Cuba. This was a calculated move, an act of controlled escalation designed to halt further Soviet military shipments without initiating full combat. Kennedy chose the term quarantine to avoid the legal definition of a blockade, which could be considered an act of war. The U.S. Navy was instructed to stop and search any ship bound for Cuba suspected of carrying offensive weapons, forcing Khrushchev into the immediate high-pressure choice of retreat or collision. Kennedy ordered a naval quarantine, deliberately stopping short of a full blockade, an act of war, to force Khrushchev's hand. During the crisis, the U.S. Strategic Air Command (SAC) raised its readiness level to DEFCON 2, Defense Condition 2, the highest alert level short of war. DEFCON 2 means next step to war, requiring forces to be ready to deploy and engage in combat within 6 hours. In practice, this meant ICBM launch keys were armed, B-52 bombers carrying nuclear payloads were put on fail-safe patrol closer to Soviet airspace, and all military leave was canceled. This tense, 13-day period was the closest the world has ever come to full nuclear exchange, with several documented close calls involving Soviet submarine operations. The U.S. moved to DEFCON 2. Nuclear forces were armed, putting the entire world one miscommunication away from global disaster. The crisis was resolved not through public confrontation, but through intense, secret diplomatic backchannels. The crisis was diffused through a secret agreement negotiated between Robert Kennedy and the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin. The public component involved Khrushchev agreeing to dismantle and withdraw the Cuban missiles under UN inspection in exchange for a U.S. public pledge not to invade Cuba. The critical secret component, however, was the U.S. agreement to quietly and swiftly remove its intermediate-range Jupiter missiles from NATO bases in Turkey, which were considered provocative by Moscow. This strategic trade-off, where Kennedy removed technically outdated missiles in exchange for the Soviet removal of a direct existential threat, allowed both leaders to save face internationally. The secrecy was vital to prevent NATO backlash and to secure Soviet cooperation. The solution was a secret deal. Soviet missiles left Cuba, and obsolete U.S. missiles were simultaneously pulled from Turkey. A key preventative measure enacted after the 1962 crisis was the establishment of the Moscow-Washington Direct Communications Link, quickly dubbed the Hotline. Operational by 1963, this was not actually a voice telephone, but a secure, dedicated teletype telex system used to transmit written messages instantly between the U.S. president and the Soviet premier. The primary goal was to prevent future crises stemming from miscommunication or delay, as occurred during the 13 days. The speed of communication was prioritized over quality, ensuring that leaders could clarify intentions during high-stress situations, thereby stabilizing the MAD equilibrium and institutionalizing de-escalation protocols. Born from the chaos, the hotline was established, a direct link to ensure future communication wouldn't be lost to misinterpretation. The Cuban Missile Crisis proved that psychological deterrence was the most powerful weapon of the Cold War. The legacy of the Cold War tactics is a masterclass in psychological deterrence. The focus definitively shifted from classical military superiority to the complex management of risk and perception. The implementation of fail-safe systems in bombers, requiring a positive confirmation code to cross a designated turnback point, minimized accidental war triggers. Furthermore, the global proxy wars, e.g., Vietnam, Afghanistan, became the new arena, allowing the superpowers to fight indirectly without invoking the nuclear trigger. This psychological maneuvering, codified by game theory and cemented by MAD, fundamentally redefined modern conflict, proving that capability only matters if the opponent believes you are willing to use it. The Cold War proved that the threat of force, managed by cold, calculated risk, was far more effective than force itself. If you seek your daily masterclass in historical strategy and the evolution of modern conflict, subscribe to Historical Tactics today.